Hi students, welcome back to this channel English Literature with Irdham. As a few days ago, we discussed the punk literature and I tried to explain it in simple and easy way to make you understand. And I also gave some literary examples and the theoretical perspectives about how the punk literature works in contemporary literary scholarship. I showed you that how this punk literature is sharing boundary line with postmodernism, where it deconstructs the traditional understanding, the traditional boundaries, or the traditional definitions of the knowledge. I also showed you that how different institutions in society, whether that is school, whether that is the and any religious institution, whether that is the hospital, whether that's the administration, how they set a doctrine, a norm for the society, and how the modern youth or the contemporary youth opposes those set rules and the regulations. I showed you that earlier this punk literature was considered as a rebellion to the dominant ideologies or the dominant discourse, and it was simply to explore something new or to deconstruct or destroy the borders of the old social or cultural boundaries. Today, I'm going to define that how the punk literature is talked in the literary theory and how it works in literary theory and the criticism. So, as punk traditional means the rebellion, but in literary theory, it is not only a rebellion in a vague or emotional sense. It refers to a mode of speculative writing that exposes how power operates through teaching, through technology, science, culture, and the space. So, punk genres are narrative of the structural resistance that reveal how modern system organize the human life. So, punk theory is a laboratory for the ideology. It's a laboratory for the discourse, and it reveals that how the different ideologies organize our social, cultural, political, and the religious life. Friedrich Jameson calls this the ideological mapping, and he says that how the punk literary theory makes visible the hidden logic of capitalism and the domination. This theory is not only about the fantasy, not prediction, but it is critical modeling of the social systems. So it doesn't blindly follow any rule, but it questions the rules. It doesn't blindly follow any ideology, any assumption, any norm, but it questions and sees it critically. For example, punk theory questions that who controls the contemporary technology, who is getting benefited and who is excluded. It questions that how the discrimination and the disparities are there in the society despite the technology, despite the ideologies, despite the intellectual capitalism. So it questions all these assumptions and challenges them. Now, let us see that there are different forms and types of the punks. The first one is the cyberpunk, capitalism, simulation, and the post-human labor. Cyberpunk is best defined as a literary form that represents late capitalism through the digital infrastructure, virtual identities, and the corporate sovereignty. So, cyberpunk is about the capitalism which works through the digital infrastructure, social media, YouTube, Instagram, and it also talks about the different types of identities on the virtual platforms and also the corporate sovereignty, the corporeal power nexus. And it says that how the information replaces the labor and how network replaces the community, because everything is available on the internet and even our identity is there on the internet. So without physically visiting or judging or analyzing any personality, read some quotes on the social media, on the Facebook or the Instagram, and you can imagine the identity or the character of any person. So cyberpunk interrogates this new kind of identity formation and also new kind of identity understandings. So simulation and hyperreality also argues that modern society or the contemporary representations are no more real. They are the hyper real. As cyberspace becomes the hyper real and our identity is digitally constructed and reality is interfaced. And power and surveillance, as per the Michel Foucault, also explains the cyberpunk cities and the disciplinary power, and it questions that how the power operates not by violence but by databases, monitoring, and the algorithms. Catherine Hale, one of the pioneer and the main theorist of posthumanism, also argues that the cyberpunk shows the shift from human as body or the biological entity to human as information pattern. The subjects become data. As earlier I mentioned, that to know any person, any character or personality, you don't need to see anybody physically, but you can simply read some quotes, read some remarks on his her Facebook or social media accounts, and you can guess or analyze the kind of persona or the character. So this means that our subjectivity and identity becomes a kind of data, or through that data one can decode the whole personality. For example, neuromancer represents us a kind of society where the protagonist is not a traditional hero. He is a disposable information worker owned by the corporations and dependent on the machines. And this novel shows that even rebellion happens inside corporate systems, and the freedom which looks real is no more real. It is directed and given by the corporates and the capitalists. As in previous discussion, I exemplified that how we voluntarily internalize the power structure and the domination, how we follow the corporeal political propagandas without even questioning them or critically analyzing them. So, Neuromancer gives us such kind of society where information is spreaded through the protagonist and the characters without any critical questioning. So that so-called freedom of the characters is no more real, but it is simulated or given by the corporates and the elite classes. Cyberpunk does not celebrate the technology. It demonstrates what the Frederick Jameson calls the cultural logic of late capitalism. It says that technology increases, but our autonomy and the privacy decreases. It questions the high technology and low standard of life. Next, we have the biopunk, and in which we would study the biopolitics, genetic capital, and the bare life. So biopunk is a narrative analysis of how political and economic power controls our biological existence. For example, our bodies are not our bodies. They are owned by somebody else, the political and economic capitalist powers. And we can be happy, we can be sad. This fragile nature of our identity, of our body, is well utilized by the corporates and the capitalists. With one single tablet or medicine, our whole body can change. Even what we eat today is full of politically loaded ideology, and it is owned by the capitalists and the scientists. So biopunk says that what seems as our real possession is not our real possession, which means that who owns our bodies, who designs our life, and who decides the survival. And there is the life and death politics, which is spreading in the contemporary society. For example, during the COVID-19, it was decided that who would be survived and who would be died. So when the life itself becomes a product and a product of capitalist market, and where the politics of life and death happens, biopunk directly criticizes that such life and death politics should not be there, and what we do, whatever we do for our living being should be critically analyzed and the questions. So biopunk is basically a politics about our body, about our genetic capital, and making us the bare life. In biopower, Foucault defines the biopolitics as power that manages the population through medicine, genetics, and the reproduction. Because capitalists, through the medicine, genetic engineering, and reproduction, decide that who would live and who would die. So, biopunk says that there is a power that governs the life itself. And Giorgio Agamben argues that modern states reduce the people or the biology to bare life that exists without the political rights. As I earlier mentioned that biopolitics is about possessing our bodies and possessing our governing our life and death without giving us our fundamental biological or the bodily right. So in biopunk, genetically modified humans are legally expendable. For example, in Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, the organs are donated and biologically modified and expanded, and they are exploited without giving them their legal rights. And even in the Wind Up Girl, we see that humans are created just for the sake of labor, and after their bodies are discarded and thrown away when they become out of the function. So biopunk also questions it, and it aligns with Donna Haraway's cyborgian theory, where it says that our biology is already political, and the natural body is actually a myth, because our natural body is manipulated and controlled by somebody else. So it is a myth, but not a reality. And Forex Craig by Margaret Atwood also presents us a corporations that patenting our DNA, the species designed for profit, and ethics replaced by the market. So in that Forex and Craig by Margaret Atwood, we see the Craig's projects. They are the neoliberal biopolitics, and life becomes a commodity. So through this way, biopunk shows that how scientific rationality becomes economic rationality, how research serves capital, not the humanity. So due to these all scientific experiments and the corporeal and capitalist research, the personal profits or the personal gains are given the priority rather than to the general humanity. The next one is the steampunk, colonial modernity, and the historical power. Steampunk is a counter historical genre that reveals how our imperial capitalism shaped the modern technology. It exposes the violence hidden in the progress. For example, Edward Said's Orientalism shows how Europe constructed the East as inferior. So, steampunk says that how the modern technology, modern identity is constructed by the West, and it shows the political propaganda are kind of misrepresentation of the East. And steampunk reconstructs this imperial gaze. And Stephen Greenblatt, also in the New Historicism, argues that literature reproduces power relations and steampunk rewrites them. So this shows that how the power nexus or power structure is created and rebuilt by the Westerns, and how the modern writers and the critics try to reconstruct those all imperial gazes and the considerations. And it also talks about the Victorian social conditions where we have the mass surveillance, we have the political manipulation, we have the class control, and this modern technology serves the empire. So, through this perspective and the critical analysis, steampunk reveals that industrial modernity was built on exploitation, the way the Victorian society was full of the exploitation and the manipulation. And the way we see there is the conflict between science and religion in the Victorian society. So the very progress of Victorian society was an organized inequality, which steampunk says and critiques. Next, we have the solar punk, ecological ethics and utopian materialism. So, solar punk is a speculative realism of sustainable social organization. It studies how the technology can be socially owned, and its foundation is from eco-criticism by Lawrence Bull, where he says that environmental imagination is a political practice. And further, the utopian Marxist Ernest Bloch argues that hope is historically necessary and solar punk operationalizes the hope. So it is related to the greenhouse, green studies, or the environmentalism, and the solar punk discusses the models that are about the climate institutions, the global cooperation, and the green finances. So it treats the politics as ecological management. Solar punk rejects the dystopia, but it proposes the structural optimism, not the naive hope. And there is the Afrofuturism and the cultural punk also, which is the reconstruction of Black history and futurity against colonial temporality. And it challenges the Western linear time, and W.E.B. Du Bois' concept, double consciousness, talks about this cultural punk where the Black identity is split by racism. And Homi Baba also says that our culture is formed in between spaces, which he says the hybrid. So these cultural punks talk about the time travel forces and says that how the historical confrontation, a racial trauma, and embodied memory constructs and creates our culture. And these past structures reshape our the present culture. And Afrofuturism also shows that the future cannot be imagined without the justice. And in punk genres, we have the cognitive estrangements, as Darko Suvin calls the cognitive estrangement, and they make systems visible by defamiliarization. For example, the corporations to megacities, capitalism to genetical labs, and racism to the time travels. So this way, we can say that cyberpunk, biopunk, steampunk, solarpunk, and Afrofuturism, they all talk about information, biology, history, ecology, and race perspective, respective, respectively. And cyberpunk talks about the digital capitalism takes its foundation from the postmodernism, whereas biopunk talks about the life commodification and takes its foundation from biopolitics. Steampunk talks about the imperial modernity, takes its foundation from post-colonialism. Solarpunk talks about the climate capitalism, takes its foundation from ecology and eco-criticism. And then Afro-futurism talks about temporal injustice, takes its foundation from race and cultural race theories. So this way, these punks theories are the punk subgenres interrogates the set domination and the power system, and it shows that how the power and ideology operates in contemporary society and how our life is getting influenced and reshaped and redesigned by this ideology during this age of science and technology. So I hope that you enjoyed this topic and would meet you with a new topic. Thank you.